Hey everybody, this is episode 7 of From Guns to Keyboards. It's a conversation between myself and Michael this time around. This time we're back.
We're back.
Before we get into the main discussion, let's jump into what's going on right now in Israel. This is currently March 30th. A lot's been going on as usual. None of it that uplifting, to be honest. But right now we have currently close to home, for me and Michael at least, we have the ongoing operations in Shifa, which have produced some, I would say, remarkable and surprising results. The current potentially upcoming invasion of Rafah, which is causing a lot of anxiety, I think, on the streets of Israel as people wait to see if they or people they know are going to get called up, because the Israeli government has hinted that they will need to basically redraft more reservists in order to make that operation happen. In the meantime, you have up in the north, Israeli striking deeper into Lebanon, allegedly hitting targets in Syria as well. This morning I saw that Israel is now being accused of harming a UN observer vehicle, injuring 3 UN observers. In addition, Lebanon's responding with increased fire into Israel, opening the question of if there's going to be a war in the north. Zooming out a little bit, we have the UN. A lot's been happening there. In Resolution 2627, the U.S. chose to abstain. This resolution demanded a ceasefire for the month of Ramadan and an unconditional release of all the hostages. The Israelis did not take that abstention well. Bibi canceled a delegation to the U.S. to discuss Rafah. And at the moment, it seems like the personal rift between Bibi Netanyahu and Joe Biden is growing even wider. At the meantime, we also have the ICJ ruling that Israel needs to increase the amount of humanitarian aid being sent into Gaza, which opens us to the question that we want to discuss today. Is the IDF a moral army?
I think to answer that question, we first need to go into a deeper question about what it actually means to be a moral army. And there are some who refer to the question of a moral army as an internal oxymoron, that by definition, armies cannot be moral. Maybe we'll leave that to the end to see whether or not we can even get to some sense of morality in warfare. But for me, when I think about what a moral army is, I look at a moral army at a question of intent. In other words, when I judge the Israeli army, the American army, or armies globally, the main fact that I look at is what is the policy and intent of soldiers on the ground, of planes in the air. What is their mission, and how are they carrying out this mission on the ground?
Okay, so I guess the question is this, because that is the big thing. Because when you start getting into questions of intent, I mean, I think you really start getting into, you open up to an even deeper question of, okay, are you fighting for a just cause? And if you are fighting for a just cause, well, doesn't that mean the ends justify the means? Like if we look at I know we don't like bringing up World War II stuff, but let's say we bring up the Soviets fighting the Nazis, right? The Soviets committed all sorts of atrocities against their own people, shooting at their own retreating soldiers kind of thing. Do the ends justify the means? As, rampaging their way through Eastern Europe, is that okay because they had a moral and just cause of defeating the Nazis?
Fair question. I don't think that intent only refers to the goal. I think intent also refers to the designed method that the army sets out for itself on the way. The main thing that I was referring to here is you have a situation that is not unique to the Israel-Hamas War. It's a situation that America found itself in Iraq, in Afghanistan, that any Western democracy finds itself in a major counterterrorism operation in the Middle East and globally, where Israel has an official policy of we are only going to target enemy combatants and we are not going to target innocent civilians. But in practice, what happens is that many innocent civilians are unfortunately killed during the course of battle. This happens in every modern war that we can think of. And when I was referring to intent, I was referring to intent in the sense of we as the IDF plan in advance who we want to go after. We intend to only go after those who harm us. And while unfortunate things can happen along the way, collateral damage, civilians being mistakenly killed, this cannot be used as a way to pin the IDF as a moral army, because the very intent of the war was focused on enemy combatants only.
So, all right, let's dive a little bit deeper into that subject then, because it is a good one, it is an important one. When the IDF, as they've done many times, they know there's a target and they drop something like a 2,000 or 1,000 pound bomb on them. They're aware that civilians are going to die. They know civilians in the area. They're aware that civilians are going to die. Is the IDF asking the question of how many civilian deaths are acceptable as long as we get that target?
I think the IDF is asking that question, but again, there is a difference between calculating collateral damage in urban warfare and looking for the match between necessary collateral damage and achieving the goals of that specific strike, versus, on the other hand, going out to intentionally target civilians. Yeah, Israel does have a very specific policy where it says that it's willing to carry out strikes on enemy positions with full knowledge that there's a high probability of collateral damage, as long as the goal of the operation is military in nature, meaning us against an enemy combatant, and the destruction of that target justifies the collateral damage that comes with it. Obviously, it goes without saying that the death of any civilian is regrettable, and neither I nor the entire Israeli army are looking to intentionally target civilians in any way, shape, or form. It's just a question of accepting that this is a certain reality of war that we need to try to minimize as much as we can, while not lying to ourselves and saying that we can bring it down to zero, because that will never happen.
All right, well, let me ask this then. Does the IDF have a number? Let's say, is the number, you have one target, is 50 civilian deaths okay? Is 100 civilian deaths okay? How do you calculate that?
So there is a specific policy as to what level of risk the Israeli army can take for the different targets that it goes after. And again, it's not we can kill X amount of civilians in order to take out this target. The Israeli army doesn't always know how many civilians may or may not be killed. It's a question of probability. It's a question of, if we're going to drop a 1-ton bomb on a crowded residential building in Khan Yunis, the building might be evacuated and only the terrorists inside will be killed. Or you might have a situation where many people are inside and you can kill a lot more than you intended at all on killing in this airstrike. So, there is a specific calculation of what is the moral way of going about different strikes, and the real variable that affects this calculation is how much is the target valuable to Israel. Meaning that if Israel identifies a specific Hamas terrorist located deep inside Rafiah and knows that targeting this terrorist will kill 500 innocent civilians with a probability of more than 90%, it will not carry out this strike, because it cannot justify killing 500 civilians just to eliminate one measly terrorist in the south of the Gaza Strip. But if Israel did have intelligence on Sinvar or on Muhammad Deif or on very senior leaders of Hamas, and knew that a strike may have a certain probability of causing collateral damage in the area near the strike, then that is a question that the IDF will definitely ask itself. And in my opinion, that's a fair moral question, because, like I said, an army needs to be judged by its intent. And the intent here, no matter what the outcome is to target enemy combatants on the battlefield.
It's to not harm civilians despite the number that have been killed, to try not to harm them, and to try and kill the enemy combatants instead. All right, so we've kind of, I think you set a pretty good baseline of what it is to be a moral army. It seems really important to Israel to be seen as a moral army. Why do you think that is?
Well, to give further context to your question, you have the Israel Defense Forces, which is quoted by some to be the most moral army in the history of Western democracy, and by its detractors as being the leaders of a genocide in the Gaza Strip. So, there is this question of how could the same army get such a high degree of complement and support for its morality, while at the same time be accused of genocide and ethnic cleansing by its detractors, and how that really plays into your question of importance here, right? Why is it important for the IDF? I think you have the obvious reasons of supporting soldiers' morale on the battlefield and showing them that their mission that they're going after is a just mission that's focused on the enemy. You have the international question of Israel's standing in the global community and its desire to maintain its reputation. But in my opinion, I think the real fundamental importance of the IDF personally defining itself as a moral army and seeking to be a moral army is out of a desire at the end of the day to focus on the mission, because that is how armies win wars. And when an army decides to do what has happened in history and other historic examples of going into an area and destroying and killing every single living creature in that place, not only is the result catastrophic from a moral perspective, but in a lot of cases the army is distracted from the original goal that they set out to accomplish. Not only is it problematic from a moral perspective, the army doesn't ultimately achieve the goal that it set out to do from the beginning. The beginning of the Israel-Hamas War, for example, started out with Israel having two very clear goals. The first goal is the complete destruction of Hamas as a military and governing entity in the Gaza Strip. And the second goal is the return of the hostages to Israel proper. These two goals are the focus of the Israeli army, and once you allow for quote-unquote immorality to filter into the ranks of the army, you, by definition, will not focus on achieving your mission. You will be focusing on other things that are not relevant to the initial mission that you set out to achieve.
Well, I guess so. That kind of brings me back a little bit to the sort of World War II example, because the type of war we're fighting today, like a counterinsurgent warfare, is very much based on, especially in today's day and age, it's very dependent on how the world sees you and how the population that you're fighting amongst sees you and how your own population sees you. Like, those perspectives really matter. And so for Israel, I think, to want to win, the problem with this, though, is that I think you have in Israeli society quite a few people who are very much in favor of let's just take the gloves off. Let's push these people into Egypt. Let's not be concerned with civilian deaths. They're not concerned with our civilian deaths. So why not just treat them the way they treat us? And why not just do everything in our power to just kill as many Hamas as possible? So what? Civilians die? That's warfare. That's how humans have been fighting for thousands of years. Despite that, the IDF, it seems like there are people, thankfully in my opinion, outside of the sort of the political representation of those voices, and I'm talking about Ben Gvir and a lot of his sort of tribe, who are saying, no, we need to fight this more intelligently and more strategically, and we do need to actually be concerned about how the world perceives this, because as we've seen, even in recent history, like Iraq and Afghanistan, if international and domestic populations get tired of how you're fighting the war, that's it. The war's over for you. And Israel, this is, I hate to say it, but this is going to be a long war. I think defeating an insurgency is a long war. And in order to have the amount of time and bandwidth that you need to go in and take out a deeply entrenched organization like Hamas, you need to be thinking in years. And the IDF's aware of that. They even were saying at the very beginning on October 9th and 10th that they were saying, look, we're expecting minimum a 1-year timeline to complete this mission.
I think you bring up a really interesting point there, especially when you speak about the dissonance between IDF policy and what many Israelis say ought to happen in the Gaza Strip. And I think the deeper question that we both need to reckon with, and certainly did reckon with during our military service, is how does that play out in practice when the army, as this enormous organization, goes out to declare war and carry out war in enemy territory? Does it have the ability to keep control of its ranks and ensure that they follow policy? And maybe you can talk a little bit about your own personal experience and how that really played into things.
Look, I was very much, my main wartime experience was those first couple of weeks, I would say, in the invasion of northern Gaza. And at the time, there was very much it didn't even feel like there was a mission so much. The mission felt like revenge. It felt like, the Israelis aren't used to losing, in my opinion, especially when it comes to military conflicts. The Israelis are basically inundated their entire childhoods and young adult lives with the IDF is the best army. Look at all these victories we have and all these things that this small, spunky upstart nation was able to accomplish militarily. And October 7th, however you want to frame it, we lost that war. I think this war, from personal perspective, I think we lost this war on October 7th. The fact that we even allowed this to happen was a failure. And coming out of that, moving into a ground invasion in Gaza, there was very much just this feeling of revenge. There was blowing up civilian homes. They would literally take us into residential neighborhoods, and the officers would say, okay, blow up that house. And we'd blow that house up. And there was looting involved and the shooting of livestock. And, there were no civilians. They'd all been evacuated, thankfully, because quite frankly, I can't imagine what the individual soldier who comes into contact with Gazan civilians, I can't imagine. I think we got a taste of it a few months ago when 3 of our hostages managed to escape and approached IDF soldiers with, by all accounts, including our own, with their hands in the air, holding white flags, shirts off, begging for their lives in Hebrew, and were shot anyways. I think that we know exactly how IDF soldiers on the ground treated Gazan civilians. And I think that is a reflection of what I just said, of the how the population actually feels versus how the more professionally minded people at the top are trying to conduct the war. And there is a difficulty, I think. I don't envy the generals who, on the one hand, need to fight a counterinsurgency, and on the other hand, have this very hot, heated, and angry population that has had over 100 years of history fighting Palestinians. And this attack, you and I talked about it at a different time. We compared it to September 11th. September 11th was terrible, and it got we were very young when it happened, but it got a lot of Americans very scared and very angry. But October 7th, there was a very personal aspect to it, because this war has been going on for so long, and everyone has been touched by it. And when Israelis saw images of Hamas fighters rolling through Sderot and Nir Oz and all these other places, they saw themselves in those homes. For us, for us in our homes in Tel Aviv, that's an hour's drive away from us. This wasn't like me waking up in California and 5-hour flight away in New York. This is our backyard, basically. And there was a real deep, visceral hatred unlike anything I think any of us have ever experienced, where we just wanted revenge.
I think you bring up a really interesting point where you talk about revenge as being your understanding of the mission and the people that you served with, their understanding of the mission when they went into North Gaza, versus what you described as the general's goals for North Gaza, which was much more formalized. There, at the time, were 2 brigades of Hamas located north of Wadi Aza, and the goal of the 3 divisions that you were a part of that went into the northern Gaza Strip at the time were to destroy these 2 brigades. And ultimately, these 2 brigades have been largely destroyed.
So maybe you can answer this question then. How does that disconnect happen? How does the general staff who have their mission, how is that not presented to the soldier on the ground like myself? Because we really had no idea what was going on.
I think it touches on a few points. First, it could just be a classic symptom of big systems that don't know how to bring down and communicate goals and missions in a top-down fashion in an effective way. It could be a symptom of that. But I think that in the Israeli case, it touches on something a little bit deeper, where you have a conscript army coupled with an enormous reserve force. In other words, soldiers that are not part of some sort of professional army that they volunteered to work in and get salaried positions in. You have an army that all Israelis, or at least in theory, all Israelis from the age of 18 are forced to serve in, and then afterwards do reserve duty in. And
Right, but it's guys like me, like high-tech workers, small business owners that came and filled the ranks of the reserve units.
Exactly. And it's not to say that professional armies get the orders from the top down from their governments and carry out exactly what they're supposed to do and don't have misunderstandings. You saw many cases of the American professional army in Iraq where soldiers on the ground understood their mission in a way that was not dictated from the Pentagon. So I don't think everything can be pinned on that. But for sure, there's a unique aspect of Israeli society where the IDF as a conscript and as a conscript army with an enormous reserve force goes into a place like the Gaza Strip. It does state clear goals for the soldiers that are supposed to kill the enemy on the other side, but the people themselves are not just robotic soldiers in a professional army that take their orders and do exactly what they're supposed to do. They're much more than that. These are real people with real thoughts who lived normal lives until they were called up to serve in this war. And they have their own understandings, not just of what the mission is, but what the mission ought to be. And I think that's what really plays out into a lot of these dynamics that we saw on the Gaza Strip.
I think also, I think you're right, especially when you say not what the mission is, but what it ought to be. I think you're absolutely right about that. I think there's a lot of, let's say you're a colonel, and I think the guy who was in charge of our brigade was also a reservist as well. So this guy, who knows what his day job is, he came out just as angry as the rest of us. But I think there's also the sort of, it is a big system, and big systems have a lot of politics. And I think that this guy also wanted to have, a check mark of, today we had a successful Yalom mission. Was that Yalom mission? I don't think anybody at the top, above his level, is really going to read and dive deep into it. They're just going to see that the Yalom force engaged and successfully completed a mission. I think that's maybe what it was. So I guess then listen, let's tie this back into the original question, and maybe we can even do this throughout the episodes. We dive deeper of. So the intent of the higher echelon general staff is, as you said, destruction of Hamas fighters, return of the hostages. But the intent of the mid-level officers and even the guys on the bottom was destruction of property. Does just because the leaders think one thing and the troops on the ground think another thing, does that still make us a moral army?
I think that when you look at global examples where the top leadership said to the soldiers, go and kill every person you see, the end result is much worse than what you had in Israel. In Israel, you had a situation where the top leadership was kind of holding back you used the word revenge, was holding back the deep emotions that a lot of soldiers had going into the Gaza Strip. And the end result wasn't perfect. You, at the end of the day, still have a situation where more than 15,000 civilians have been killed in the Gaza Strip. As much as you and I support the justness of this war against Hamas, I'm sure that you and I can both agree that the death of any civilian is a tragedy. And if any civilian did die in this war, which clearly was the case in practice, then we need to go back and learn how to be better next time. Yeah, so
to jump off that as well, look, there's accountability, I think is the word. And I think accountability is what's really missing from this war. I have not seen any soldier brought up on charges. I mean, the most I've seen to try and rein in the looting is, what's the Ramakal's name? Haggai Levy? What's his name?
Herzia Levy.
Herzia Levy. So Herzia Levy, I saw him on the news basically it sounded more like pleading, honestly, with soldiers and officers to stop looting, stop doing these like illegal things. But no soldier was brought up on charges. No one was disciplined in a military court. The only exception being, I think, maybe those two reservists who shot the Jewish guy in Jerusalem during a terrorist attack, who he tried to help them and then later was on his knees and they shot him. I think maybe those two guys were brought up on charges, but aside from them, nobody. And so this to me is a reflection of the degradation. And again, because I can't even say necessarily I blame the higher echelons in the IDF. They need public support on their side. If they start bringing up soldiers on charges after they were just, dragged out of their homes and forced to the front lines after a disaster that is the fault of these guys at the top for not preventing, the public's going to very quickly turn against the IDF.
Yeah.
So you're in a really tough, but at the same time, you are sacrificing your morality in order to function.
So then, if we're going to tie that into our original question of, is the IDF a moral army? What are the main criteria that we ought to look at in order to judge that morality? We spoke about intent already as being one of the potential criteria. What are the parameters that we have to look at to answer this question?
I think results. You can have the best intent in the world, but if you're producing terrible results, look, I can get on a microphone. Let's say I'm, wave a magic wand and I'm the general chief of staff of the IDF. I can make all the speeches I want, but if at the end of the day, if my troops on the ground are shooting civilians and looting homes and doing these very unprofessional, immoral acts, and I'm not doing anything about it, then it doesn't really matter what I'm saying. Yeah. I might as well be telling them to do it, because if they're not being punished for it, if there's no one being, like, why does the military enforce such strict punishments? It's not only to train the individual soldier to be better, it's to set an example to the rest of the soldiers that, hey, you don't want to be like this guy. This guy screwed up and didn't obey orders, and this is what's going to happen to you if you do the same thing. And that's it's important in any society, but in the military especially, having strict discipline is essential if you want to even be considered, I think, a moral army.
So you brought up the issue of results here, which is the other dimension through which we can analyze the morality of the Israel Defense Forces. Here is really a question of, what are the objective results-based statistics that we ought to look at in order to judge morality? Because you say, okay, let's look at results. And then that brings us to the question of, for example, in the field of civilian casualties, is the number of civilian casualties in the Gaza Strip excessively high in relation to the mission that Israel set out to achieve, and the number of terrorists that were killed during this operation? An interesting article was published in Newsweek 5 days ago by John Spencer titled, "Israel has created a new standard for urban warfare. Why will no one admit it?" in which the author, who is the chair of urban warfare studies at the Modern War Institute of West Point, basically goes on to argue that Israel has carried out an incredibly complex mission in the Gaza Strip. The number of civilian casualties, or the ratio of civilian casualties to combat casualties or enemy combatant casualties, is roughly 1.5 to 1. And depending on how you count, the actual number might be closer to 1 for 1. In other words, for every terrorist that Israel killed, there was a collateral damage of approximately 1 civilian that was also killed during the course of this conflict. And the author goes on to argue that this number, compared to other global conflicts, is relatively low.
Yeah, it is true. I mean, look, John Spencer, I don't know too much about him. He's not only, he's a 25-year military vet, 2 tours in Iraq. He's the PhD, I used to say chairman of urban warfare studies. He has a great podcast too, actually, where he talks about urban warfare. This guy certainly seems like he knows what he's talking about. That being said, I think we should caveat this, just to be clear. He wrote this article because he was in Israel recently, and my guess he spent a lot of time with Israeli defense officials and very much hearing their narrative, although he did write that he actually was in Gaza a little bit as well. So he certainly saw that perspective. That being said, let's go off. Let's just say that he's right. That Israel is at a 2 for 1 or a 1 for 1 in terms of civilian to insurgent ratio, and that this is a new style of urban warfare that other countries need to seek to emulate. And he does give a lot of credit. He does say we do things like, we've basically given up on the element of surprise by essentially broadcasting our troop movement where we're going to be, which is the complete antithesis of maneuver warfare, which up until this point was the standard military doctrine for Western-style armies. It's how the U.S. conquered Iraq in 3 weeks. It's what we did in Afghanistan. It's essentially what you're supposed to do as war, which is surprise and overwhelm your enemies with incredible amounts of force, and then you sort of break them both morally and physically. That being said, I mean, we can tout that all we want, but at the same time, I mean, we're seeing how if it's a 1-for-1, which I find a little difficult to believe. But if let's say we have 20,000 civilian deaths and 10,000 dead Hamas fighters, I mean, that's still an extraordinarily high number. And the question is, for me, that I have to ask is, does it even matter if we're being that moral and we've still killed 20,000 civilians?
I guess that really goes into a deeper question of, did Israel have a choice in the matter? If we could have carried out this exact same mission and been just as successful in killing Hamas members while lowering the number of civilians that were killed during the course of the war, then that's one thing. But I'm not entirely sure that there was another way of going about this.
All right, so let me present to you the detractor suggestion then, which is, look, after October 7th, Israel should have just entered negotiations and just said, okay, here's your 6,000 prisoners, give us back our hostages.
I think that after October 7th, Israel was put in a situation where its decision on how it would respond would radiate far beyond what happened in the Gaza Strip. It would radiate to Hezbollah in Lebanon, to Syria, to the Iranian regime, and to all of its proxies throughout the Middle East from Yemen and beyond. I think that if Israel did not respond strong after October 7th and break out its offensive the way that it did from October 7th until today, immediately after the massacre, Israel would find itself in a much worse situation than it's in right now. I think that Hezbollah would be much more aggressive in the north of the country. I think that you would see Syria and the Assad regime feeling a lot more comfortable to support Iranian proxies in the region, especially in Lebanon. I think you would be seeing a lot more aggressive behavior from the Houthis in Yemen. And I think you might even have seen direct Iranian involvement in this conflict. Israel, in my opinion, had no other choice on October 7th and afterwards but to respond with an iron fist in order to show fundamentally to the entire Middle East that the result of massacres like October 7th is the complete destruction of the regime that carried out the attack.
I guess I want to say regardless of the number of civilians that die in the process. But it's not completely regardless because, yes, I do want to give the Israelis credit where they're due. They are taking precautions and ensuring that civilians don't die, but at the same time, a lot of civilians are dying. Hamas is gaining more strength and power. And look, I mean, we're playing a little bit into hypotheticals. I know the Israelis have a belief that in deterrence, there's a strong belief in deterrence, and that in order to prevent attacks, Israel needs to respond very ferociously. There was, I think, the best example I can give is probably the 1976 Entebbe raid, which kind of saw an end to airline hijackings, which Israel had been dealing with for the better part of a decade. But if you really dive into what happened there, what we see is that by 1973, airline hijackings around the world had decreased substantially. And that wasn't because of these, very flashy and public-loving operations like Entebbe. It was because that countries around the world, including Israel, were investing heavily in airport security, something that hadn't really existed. So wouldn't preventing another October 7th just mean that Israel needs to take its border threats a little bit more seriously and not rely so heavily on technology and have troops along the border? Couldn't Israel have done that exchange, strengthened its borders with conscripts, and then move forward from there in potentially a different way of attacking Hamas?
I think that it definitely needs to carry out these defensive measures. I think you're 100% right, but I think defensive measures alone would not be successful in preventing a future attack by Hamas. We have a countless number of historic examples of Israel and other countries who have developed the most intricate defensive formations with and without technology, with and without soldiers, with and without every possible variable that you can imagine in order to prevent an invading army from cutting through. And if there's one thing that has always stayed constant in all of these examples, no matter how strong you build the defensive line, it can always be broken.
No, that's definitely true. You're right. Like that is one of the disadvantages of defense is that you are constantly on the response. The opponent has the advantage of being able to look at your defenses, find the weak points, and exploit them, whereas you are constantly changing, adapting to what they're doing. I guess the question is this then, because look, there's a major example of I'm not suggesting, by the way, that that's all Israel should have done. I'm trying to look back now, almost 6 months later, with a little bit clearer eyes on like what could we have done differently to prevent this extraordinary amount of civilian death. And back in the early or the mid 2010s, Israel had incredibly strong intelligence in Gaza, to the point that you almost had Hamas replacing its commanders. Like, I think there was a time where they were replacing once every couple of months because Israel was so successful in assassinating Hamas commanders. And we know that Israel had a policy of supporting Hamas because we wanted to use them as useful idiots in order to not have to negotiate with the Palestinians at all in regards to a state. I wonder if after October 7th, Israel might have taken a different approach of, okay, let's rebuild our human intelligence assets, on the ground in Gaza. Let's strengthen our borders and let's attack Hamas in a smarter, more targeted way.
I think targeted attacks are fair when you're going up against a pure terrorist organization that behaves like a terrorist organization and acts like a terrorist organization. But Hamas and Hezbollah are, the former Ramatkal, the former Israeli chief of staff, referred to them quite accurately as semi-armies, meaning Hamas and Hezbollah are, in addition to being terror organizations, are also these semi-armies that have brigades, they have battalions. They function very much like an army in a lot of ways. And I think that using targeted intelligence and aerial strikes to go after a semi-army is by design not going to be 100% successful. It's by design going to allow you to hit targets that are available from the air, that are exposed to the air, hit targets that are easy to get through targeted special forces raids. They're not going to allow you to bring about the total destruction that you can achieve through massive ground maneuver. And that's really what Israel set out for in this war. Again, the goals of this war was not to deter Hamas. It was not to give them a slap on the wrist before we go into another round of fighting, like what Israel used to do in its many rounds of fighting with Gaza. The goals of the war was to completely destroy Hamas as a military and governing organization while facilitating the return of hostages to Israel.
Now, listen, I get that, but I have to ask the question, because with emotions running as high as they were post-October 7th, do you really think the IDF was thinking in a purely clear, logical, and tactical way?
I don't know what to say about the IDF. I think that definitely in the initial shock of dealing with the invasion, the army, of course, made many faults, including the intelligence failure of predicting the invasion and the initial operational response to that invasion that I'm sure will be investigated many times over in the state of Israel and globally. But in terms of thinking clearly, I think definitely the Israeli population was, of course, motivated mainly by emotion and desire for revenge more than anything else. And I think that
I also think they just wanted to feel safe.
Want to feel safe, of course.
I mean, most Israelis, from what I've heard, most Israelis didn't leave their houses for 2 weeks.
Yeah.
Tel Aviv, major nightlife city, was basically dead for like a month and a half post October 7th.
Absolutely. And again, and this brings us back to what we discussed earlier, which is how does an army stay moral, if we even have an understanding of what morality is in an army, where there is a dissonance between the fighting ranks and the commanding ranks.
And a dissonance between, because the fighting ranks, really, because we're talking about conscripts here, the fighting ranks are really more a representation of Israeli society, of a society that is, as we mentioned, is traumatized, is not just from that moment, but generations of trauma, fighting Palestinians, turning on the news and seeing, horrible attacks like the Coastal Road Massacre and Megiddo Massacre, all these really, really horrible things that have stayed in the Israeli conscious and Israeli DNA for generations. Look, it's not just the troops on the ground. It's also the reservists themselves are a reflection of Israeli society because they really come from it. And, when you see the Israelis who are just absolutely incensed by what happened on October 7th and this desire for just revenge, it does lead a lot of detractors to say that it's actually Israeli society that is immoral. And I have a big problem with people who say that because most people have no idea how it feels to grow up with these images and see these things. And it's hard to tell someone how to feel when when an hour away from your home, you just had 1,200 people massacred by people who at one point or another have openly declared for your destruction and removal. It's very difficult. How do you tell someone who a friend has gotten kidnapped and is now sitting somewhere in Gaza, or whose parents have just been killed? How do you tell them how to feel? I think some people are very quick to judge, and they definitely want to project their own already sort of preconceived beliefs on Israel. That being said, there is the other side too, where Israel does claim to be, we are a modern, humanist, liberal Western nation. And as such, we believe in these Western principles, and Western principles don't get mitigating circumstances. You don't get to pick and choose when you want to be a part of that world and have a seat at the table with all the other, first world countries and say, we're going to behave like you guys in this scenario, but in these ones, we're going to go off and do our own thing, and we don't want to hear about it.
Maybe then these values that we have, especially when it comes to the morality of war, are values that we know are hard to adhere to on an emotional level.
Absolutely.
But we adhere to them knowing that they'll kind of pull us and keep us in check as we go into battle in places like Gaza, or maybe soon in Lebanon. Like maybe it's not, the dissonance between what our heart tells us after the October 7th massacre and what our gut instinct is versus the moral values of a Western army. Maybe there is no real dissonance there. Maybe we accept these values for what they are because we know that the gap between these two things force us in place and at least keep us in check to a certain degree, and ensure that we don't cross boundaries that are well beyond what the Israeli army has done in the Gaza Strip in terms of civilian casualties.
It could be. I mean, it could be that at least you can say the IDF has some kind of guiding light, that we have enough shame for for the IDF's chief of staff to stand up and say, looting's not okay, destruction of civilian property is not okay. Whereas, you have like a nation like Russia, for instance, who you don't really see that from them at all. They don't have these same guiding principles. We just saw as well, after the ISIS-linked attack in Moscow, they themselves, the Russian government, released photos of their soldiers and police torturing suspects, not even convicted criminals, just suspects, electrocuting their testicles, like apparently chopped off one guy's ear and made him eat it. Like this is the difference, I think, between certainly what we would consider an immoral versus a moral army, is that, a moral army would not do these things, or would have enough shame at least to recognize when it was wrong. I think that kind of comes back to the intent, is that, yeah, these things do happen in the heat of battle and especially when emotions are high, but at least it has enough shame to understand that that is not okay.
So I want to tie in this conversation that we're having about intent to the question of humanitarian aid. Israel is reckoning with alongside the entire international community, where much of the international community is positive that Israel is not doing enough to provide humanitarian aid to the residents of the Gaza Strip. You have the ICJ recently coming down with a ruling that Israel needs to increase the amount of humanitarian aid to Gaza. You have personal pleas by Israel's friends and allies in the international community to increase aid to Gaza. And if we take this lens of morality and warfare, of intent and results, which is the two things that we really looked at, and we look through this lens at the question of humanitarian aid, is the IDF doing what it should be doing as a moral army in this war?
So, I wrote about this in one of the Medium pieces, where when it comes to fighting in a counterinsurgency, to quote Colin Powell, you break it, you buy it. Like, we are now the dominant military power in large swaths of northern and eastern Gaza. The people who are still living there, who chose to remain there, are now our responsibility, and we need to take care of them. We are essentially the ruling government there. So I would say that, look, I haven't been on the ground in recent months in Gaza. I can't say I've seen any Gazan civilians myself, so all I hear is the same reports that anybody else hears. In terms of humanitarian aid, is Israel doing enough? I would say even if they are, how do we know? The Israeli government is not trying to advertise itself as giving humanitarian aid to the Gazans, and I think a lot of that has to do with politics. Whereas the current administration wants to be seen as tough on terror and tough on Hamas, and if soldiers are seen escorting humanitarian aid into Gaza and potentially dying for it, it's going to very much anger the supporters of this particular government's coalition. So, look, it's the iceberg effect, right? All we see is the tip of the iceberg. And we know that there were IDF soldiers a few weeks ago near a humanitarian aid drop because there were then reports of those soldiers shooting at Palestinians. That may have been one of several hundred aid distributions. We don't really know because the government doesn't really want to talk about it. That being said, if based on reports and if assuming this ICJ report is true, then my personal assumption is that no, Israel is not doing enough, and that Israel should be, to quote Colin Powell on this one, you break it, you buy it. We are the ruling power now in northern and eastern Gaza, and we need to be taking care of the civilians there.
Well, that's really the question. We definitely are the dominant military force in northern Gaza, but I don't know if we've achieved the role of ruling power yet in northern Gaza, where we have the ability to set up a fully functioning governing entity in these areas of the Gaza Strip. And I think that really goes into the Israeli counter-argument on humanitarian aid, where the Israelis counter-argue that the United Nations is the real agency or the real organization that's holding up humanitarian aid to the Gaza Strip because they themselves don't feel comfortable sending in aid trucks into the Gaza Strip and putting their people at risk without there being a clear governing entity that will both ensure the safety of these humanitarian corridors and the distribution of aid in the Gaza Strip. And we're seeing this back and forth between both sides. My assumption, with the limited information that we have, is that it really comes down to a question of ability. For Israel to provide humanitarian aid to the Gaza Strip, it can't just wake up tomorrow morning and suddenly allow for all these trucks to come in and to distribute aid to the civilians there. That will inevitably lead to a disaster where either all the trucks will be pillaged by local militant factions, or they will fall into the hands of Hamas, who can use the aid to continue funding their war effort. So,
which we do know that they are doing. There's plenty of reports on the ground showing Hamas and other gangs basically selling the aid on the black market.
Exactly. So, going off of the quote that you said, you break it, you buy it, there is a part of me that does agree with you, but I think that in order for Israel to put this into practice, it can't just suddenly say we're going to provide humanitarian aid. It has to fully invest in becoming a de facto government of the Palestinians in the north part of the Gaza Strip. Otherwise, it has no way of providing aid in a safe way to the civilians there.
I agree. I think not even necessarily a functioning government, but what it does need to go. Of course, UN truck drivers don't want to drive into Gaza by themselves. Of course they don't. I wouldn't want to. It's the Israeli government's responsibility, in my opinion, to escort those drivers into there and to ensure that the aid is being distributed safely. And in order to do that, you don't necessarily need to become a government so much, but what you do need to do is you need to change the way you're operating in the Gaza Strip, which means you need to. I think right now there aren't enough soldiers to do that. So number one, this requires probably reconscripting people. And number two, requires reconscripting people for the hardest part of any counterinsurgency, which is trying to help the local population while still being attacked by insurgents. Which means that Israelis are going to turn on the TV and they're going to see that so-and-so, age 33, with a 3-year-old and a 1-year-old at home and a wife, has now been killed while guarding guarding food that was being given to Gazan civilians. That's a hard pill for Israelis. That's a hard pill for any nation to swallow.
Any nation.
The Americans had a lot of trouble tolerating it, and the Israelis in particular, with the context of this war, which they've been fighting the Palestinians, for well over 100 years at this point, just the idea that they would be helping people who just a few months ago were cheering the display of Israeli corpses being paraded through Gaza City is incredibly repulsive. And I think this government in particular has no political maneuvering in order to be able to do such a thing. So again, we want to tie this right back into the moral question, which is first of all, do you agree with what I said? And if we're unwilling as a society and as an army to take care of the people whose lives have now been flipped upside down, are we moral?
I think that we are moral. I think that our morality needs to come with a certain degree of modesty, where we realize that there is no way that we could have gone about this war and come out with a morality score of 10 out of 10. I think that this war, like any war that a Western democracy fights against a terrorist organization, is inevitably going to cause us and lead us to ask certain questions about the ethical code by which we are carrying out this fighting. I think that part of our morality is the very fact that we even care to take out the time to ask these questions and to really think about the stuff that we've done and are doing and look at ways for us to improve. And specifically on the question of humanitarian aid, I think on top of the lack of willingness is truly a lack of ability. I think that that's the elephant in the room that's sitting behind the humanitarian aid question here, where it's not just the political lack of will, it's not just the logistical lack of will, it's not just the opinion-based lack of will or the public-based lack of will. It's a genuine inability of the Israel Defense Forces to provide aid in a mass way to the civilians of Gaza without providing a governing body to the
I have to disagree with you fundamentally. And this is where you and I are going to disagree fundamentally, because I think the IDF physically has the ability to provide the aid to the Gazan people. I think that to do so, they would need to absorb casualties, which politically is unacceptable to Israel, to the Israeli society. But I think that physically we were absolutely capable of doing it. I think that, in the history we're now coming on, in terms of insurgency warfare and counterinsurgency doctrine, theory, and practice, we're now coming on almost 70 years at this point, and we've seen nations do it in incredibly hostile regions. And there's no reason for us to say that, look, on the one hand, we're able to warn civilians to evacuate and drop all these flyers and do all these incredible things. But, for the ones that don't, like in the article we saw, that about 10 to 15% stay behind, and we're just going to shrug our shoulders and say, sorry, we can't. Like, we can't help you if you won't help yourself, kind of thing.
Right.
And I get that impulse, but I do think that on a purely logistical level, if Israel wanted to escort UN aid trucks and distribute food, we could.
Again, I'm not saying that it's impossible. I think you're right that there is a possibility for Israel to do this. When I'm referring to ability, I'm not referring to ability in an objective sense of is it objectively possible to carry out a mission like this? Of course it's objectively possible. When I'm referring to ability, I'm saying, does Israel in practice have the resources at its disposal to carry out this sort of operation, which you yourself said would inevitably force Israel to re-enlist many reserves, to take over as the governing entity of the northern Gaza Strip, and then from there the rest of the Gaza Strip, Khan Yunis, Rafiq, Deir el-Balah, without exception, and somehow balance these major troop requirements with a possible and inevitable war in the north with Lebanon, where Israel is going to need its entire standing army and reserve forces to potentially go and invade South Lebanon up to the Litani River. So again, I agree with you that objectively anything that's possible. It's all a question of how much you're willing to invest. I think the real challenge is when you start looking at it in practice in terms of a resource game. Does Israel have the means to carry out this sort of op?
Well, you make a good point with the North, because if the North truly is Israel's next step, then yes, you're right. Resources-wise, I think maybe we are a little bit lacking in terms of being able to distribute that aid. But at the same time, from a purely principled standpoint, I do think that we have a moral obligation to the people who are now under our direct military control in Gaza.
That's for sure.
All right, let's move on. I think maybe to our last question we wanted to ask ourselves, which can war ever be moral? Which is, go ahead.
I think in the best case scenario, war could be moral to a reasonable degree. Meaning, I don't think that any war can happen without us feeling a little bit uncomfortable with its results. Civilians are going to die. That's an inevitable result of every war in all of history. And once you accept that fact, you know that you are going to breach some sort of moral territory. But at the end of the day, if the intent of the belligerent party is to achieve its goal, and if the goal itself is designed in a moral and ethical fashion, then I do believe that we can achieve the status of moral army, at least to a reasonable degree, knowing that even with our best of intent and our best of desires, we're not going to be 100% moral and 100% ethical.
I think at the end of the day, when it comes to war, you're always kind of picking between two evils, basically. I mean, I take this war, for example. Like, Israel has a moral obligation to its own civilians, which, if you take that to its extreme, or to not its own civilians, its own people, including civilians and soldiers, which if you take that to its ultimate extreme, then anything is acceptable. I mean, especially when you take this conflict, because a lot of Israelis do believe that this is an existential war, that this whole thing between us and the Palestinians is very existential. And when you take what a lot of the Palestinians are saying, I would agree. It certainly is. The maximalist Palestinian goal is to the destruction of Israel and the return of all land to Palestine and the removal of most of its Jewish population. So yeah, there is an existential element to it. And in that case, your only moral obligation is to yourself and your people, and what is not permissible in that kind of war. That being said, we as Israelis, we like to view ourselves as always, and as Jewish people in general, Jews have always considered themselves a very moral and ethical people.
The light unto the nations.
Light unto the nation. Historically, going back to thousands of years, we consider ourselves to be a very moral and ethical people. And so if we're going to engage in warfare, even one like this, then to maintain that standard of caring about the sanctity of human life then requires us to potentially put ourselves in immense danger. So either way, you're choosing between, you have to sacrifice one morality for another, in my opinion. Can any war like that be totally, can any war be moral then, if you're basically the choices between the civilian population and yourself? I don't know. I want to believe that yes. I want to believe that there is a war that can be fought, like a counterinsurgent style of warfare that can be very moral. I believe that I know that there are some very smart people who are working on that. Unfortunately, when it comes down to the human aspect, when you take people and their emotions and the anger that's felt in a conflict like this, or any kind of conflict, really. It's hard to stay logical and rational and to keep those principles in mind when you're surrounded by so much horrible death and suffering. And yeah, I think we're going to wrap it up there. So thank you for listening, everybody. Stay safe.
And we'll see you again for episode 8.